So, obviously, I talk a lot to my perimenopausal and postmenopausal women about protein and getting enough in the diet. Can you give me a couple of tips and hints? Because a lot of women go, yeah, I know about the protein. I'm working hard with the protein. But actually, in real life, people don't really know how much is more protein and what should they be aiming for, like in real terms. And I also think sometimes whenever we talk in grams or that's very tricky for people to visualize. So I'm just wondering if you could kind of simplify it down into, is it one pork chop or what is it that you're thinking?
There might be differing needs depending on the individuals, but I guess as not a random guide, a general guide, what I usually do with my clients is talk about how we would form a balanced meal or a balanced plate. And so the components of that would be around a quarter of the plate is our protein, about half of our plate are our plants, vegetables, salads, or perhaps even fruits if we're talking breakfast. And then a quarter of our plate will be our whole grains. And so people tend to sort of find that a little bit easier with lunches and dinners. So I'll just sort of mention breakfast first because this is typically the area where women tend not to get enough protein in because our typical breakfast foods like a bowl of cereal or some toast is generally going to be a good source of our carbohydrates and some fiber, but we're missing the protein. So in terms of breakfast options, which are sometimes a little bit harder, eggs are an obvious one, but a lot of people don't necessarily feel like they've got the time to be cooking that up in the morning. So, this is where I might use something like a little bit of protein powder. I don't have my clients chugging protein shakes 24/7, but we might use a little bit of protein powder to enhance, some porridge or some overnight oats. We might use high protein yogurt or baked beans or cottage cheese in terms of helping to increase. So for breakfast, I would just sort of be more focused on getting in a source of protein for starters. So I know we weren't talking grams, but generally sort of 20 to 30 grams is the minimum amount of protein that we'd be looking for in a meal. So in terms of sort of getting that, that's roughly going to be sort of a hand size. If we're having sort of meat or chicken or fish, it's roughly sort of a bit bigger than our palm, probably closer to a hand size. And they're the types of portions that we'd be looking for.
Yeah, no, that's great. And in terms of using like nuts and seeds as well?
Yeah, so it's really difficult because we eat foods, we don't eat nutrients. And so, most foods are a combination of nutrients. So nuts and seeds, have a source of protein. They're also a source of healthy fats. For me, with my clients, when we're looking to lose weight, is that I would tend to count things like our nuts and seeds more as our healthy fat component. There is a sort of fine line between healthy eating and eating for fat loss. And so being mindful of portions of nuts and seeds, if we are looking for weight loss, is something that we look at, but absolutely really important to include those things. So for the purposes of my clients who are mostly looking to lose weight, I would usually sort of think about our nuts and seeds as our fats and flavors. So an important part of the meal, but not the bulk in terms of where we get our protein from.
Okay. And you mentioned protein powder. Can I ask you what your thoughts are on whey-based protein powder?
Or consume sort of dairy-based products. Just a whey protein isolate is usually what I recommend. There's a big difference between sort of a good quality protein powder that has minimal ingredients versus some of the things on the market with lots of fillers, lots of flavors. You can get, birthday cake flavored protein powders that have got lots of stuff in them. So usually for my clients, I'd be recommending something really plain. I usually recommend the raw or unflavored options because often sort of, for many of the whey proteins, the only ingredient is the whey protein versus extra fillers and sweeteners. So yeah, if people are happy to consume dairy, then a whey protein isolate. Otherwise, there's some plant-based alternatives as well.
The only thing that I sometimes see with whey protein is I think it can definitely make some people's skin worse. So if people are having skin issues, I would tend to steer away from that. You mentioned earlier inflammatory foods. What do you mean by that?
Talk about things in terms of anti-inflammatory eating patterns. So rather than sort of demonizing, individual foods, we talk about patterns in general. So for most of us, we want to be following anti-inflammatory eating patterns, but also that's extra important for women going through that menopausal transition. So this is sort of where I guess the Mediterranean diet has come into popularity over the years as well, because that sort of style of eating promotes sort of anti-inflammatory principles. So for that would be minimizing, I guess, our intake of our discretionary foods, so foods that don't sort of look too much like their original ingredients. So these are things that we would sort of commonly label junk foods, so minimizing our intake of our discretionary foods and really maximizing our intake of whole foods, so our fruits and vegetables, whole grains as well, nuts and seeds and healthy fats. Things like our oily fish as well can be really important. So I guess, when we think about eating patterns, we don't necessarily need to demonize foods, or same again, we don't need to put health halos on specific foods. It's about our patterns overall and having a look at what we're doing overall versus sort of worrying too much about each food that we may or may not be eating.
One of the other questions that people seem to be quite puzzled about is oil, which type of oil to use to cook their food, to use coconut oil or not. And it seems like every time you walk through the supermarket, that oil area of the supermarket just seems to be getting bigger and bigger with more and more oils. And it can become a little bit sort of confusing, and people can end up with a bit of analysis paralysis. And obviously, I know that extra virgin olive oil is often sort of trumped as being the healthiest. What are your thoughts on various oils? Which ones would you recommend?
Great question. And anybody who's been online looking at nutrition things will know that it's a very controversial space in terms of people with different arguments. I'm generally in the extra virgin olive oil camp, in the sense that it's made up of a good fat profile. Good quality extra virgin olive oil is rich in sort of its antioxidants and polyphenols. And what that does and what that means is it's a very stable oil. So for a little while, there was a bit of debate as to whether or not extra virgin olive oil was a good oil to cook with. The smoke point is reasonably high, but because of that antioxidant and polyphenol content, it actually makes it reasonably stable. So as far as a versatile oil goes, for most cooking, salad dressings, those sorts of things, extra virgin olive oil will always be my pick. I wish I'd sort of bought shares in coconut products, a decade ago, because I think they've been marketed extremely well. I don't think that they're sort of terrible. I don't think that they're the magical products that people are, often sort of market them as. So, yes, for other things, it comes down to the taste profile and the type of thing that you're making that I think will dictate the type of oil that you choose. But first and foremost, I generally recommend an extra virgin olive oil as your main household oil.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And so I'm an Irish girl, as you can tell. We like a potato in Ireland. The great debate is to potato or not to potato. I love potatoes. Are potatoes good for you or not?
Yes, they are. I feel like the poor potato, its reputation has really taken a beating. So when I'm talking about a potato, I am talking about a potato, preferably in its jacket. I'm not talking about a deep fried chip potato that you get at the pub. But in terms of a jacket potato, it's a really great source of fiber and lots of other nutrients as well. There's also what they call sort of like a satiating index, where they have a look at different foods and actually how filling and how satiating they are. And potato ranks really, really highly. And so this is what happens that I see really commonly is when people are trying to lose weight, they end up creating these very light meals. So they take the potato off the plate. We've got, maybe some chicken and some broccoli there, and it's really light, or a salad, tuna salad with some, tuna and lettuce. And what we find is that, they're not satiated, they're not filling up. So then they'll end up being hungry, they'll need to snack later. So my preference is to build really filling and satisfying meals. And a potato is a really great source of that sort of carbohydrate and fuel, and also something that's going to be really satiating. Another argument in the potato camp is that we know that cooked and cooled starches, resistant starches, are very good for us in terms of our gut health. So this is something like a potato salad. We cook it and cool it. It's a really good source of the resistant starches, which is great for our gut. So I'm definitely team potato.
Okay, so potato salad, good, tick. Baked potato, good, tick. French fries, as we all know, probably not so healthy, maybe occasionally kind of thing. In terms of things like pasta, so I do feel like a lot of women of my vintage often feel like they can't have pasta, they can't have bread, they can't have potatoes because they're trying to manage their weight. Is that similar to potato, or what are your thoughts on those ingredients?
Absolutely. And I guess I should also preface this by saying that people will have different needs, different allergies, intolerances, other things. But just sort of speaking generally, certainly we don't need to cut out these sorts of foods in order to lose weight. What we do know is that as we, particularly females, as we get a little bit older and our hormones start to shift and change, that our ability to utilize our carb fuels is blunted a little bit. So we do need to moderate our intake, but we don't actually need to cut it out. So helping my clients sort of understand portions and how they can work these foods into their days and into their weeks is something that I do. Um, there is, I guess, a little bit of reasoning that we would want to be eating these foods perhaps a bit earlier in the day when we are a little bit more metabolically active. So, breakfast and lunches versus kind of having a really, really heavy dinner. But then, there's also what's perfect versus what's practical in terms of our lifestyles as well. So it does come down to moderating and portion size versus needing to cut out. Actually, in terms of the research around weight management, what that shows is that, as long as our calories and protein are where they need to be, our carbs and fats can actually fall where they fall. This comes down to personal preference. So, keto is not necessarily superior to a different style of weight loss diet. It's about finding the right pattern and style that works for you.
I am sorry, I'm going to pick your brain a little bit now about specific foods that lots of women seem to talk a lot about. So bread. Everyone seems to be a little bit confused about bread, whether bread's good for you. Should they only be having sourdough bread or bread brought from a bakery, not the supermarket? And I know that you're always very good about saying everything in moderation, but where are we with the whole bread scenario?
Same as sort of potatoes and pasta in the sense that it can be a really good we can get a really good source of whole grains and fiber from a good quality bread. So usually sort of a bread that's based around wholemeal and whole grains would be my preference. There's great breads at bakeries, but we've also got some really great supermarket breads as well. So, expense is not necessarily equate to quality. As long as we're looking for wholemeal flours and whole grains where we can, there's a lot of great supermarket brands and other brands as well. Comes down to quantities and comes down to sort of pairing it, making sure that we are, again, sort of with carbs, we want carbs to have friends with them. So making sure that we've got some protein and some plants coming in as well. But, a good old sandwich, like they've really gone out of favor, but having a sandwich with some protein and a big whack of salad can be a really satisfying lunch, meaning again that's going to reflect well in terms of our snacking and our sort of satiation later in the day. So yeah, I do think bread's probably been a little bit demonized with the potato, but if we're using good quality and in the right proportions, then I would think it can be an asset to our diet.
I've noticed recently there's breads with added protein. Is that a gimmicky thing, or are they a reasonable purchase?
So, I mean, protein's obviously in fashion at the moment because you'll see that everything in the supermarket is now got added protein. There's certain situations where I would use those types of products, like the higher protein breads. So, an example might be, if somebody's running out the door and they just want a bit of toast and Vegemite in the morning, using a protein bread can be really helpful because it at least sort of then starts you off the day with some protein. The other time I might use it is if you've got sort of a soup that might be more of a veggie base. Having a slice of protein toast on the side can be a really helpful way just to boost up the protein in the meal. I'm not going to pretend that they taste like yummy fresh bread because the texture is actually different. So good for toast, not so good for sandwiches. And there's a couple of, as I said, there's a couple of circumstances where these sorts of products can be really helpful.
Cheese. What do you think about cheese? Lots of women tell me that they give up their husband but not give up cheese. So what are your thoughts on cheese? How much cheese is too much cheese?
I think 10 years ago, I probably would have been a bit tighter around cheese, but I think also, and again, this comes down to individual tolerances as well, but assuming that you can tolerate cheese and tolerate dairy, then again, I think it can be an asset. I would usually sort of put cheese more in our fats and flavors category versus a source of protein. Probably cottage cheese is the exception to that. So I definitely think that cheese can be a really something that can add flavor to foods and also add a little bit of fats and protein as well. So again, I'm pro cheese.
What is it about cottage cheese? I can remember even as a child in the 1980s in Ireland, my mother being on a diet and having cottage cheese. It looked revolting to me, and I have to admit I've never willingly ate it. But what is it about cottage cheese that's so great?
Also protein, and I guess it's a non-meat option as well. So for people who aren't eating meats then and are eating dairy, then cottage cheese can be a lean source of protein. It's also pretty versatile. Again, I was grossed out by it for so many years because just that texture. But now that I've eaten it as an adult, I'm like, actually, it's pretty good. It's really versatile. So things that my clients might do in terms of savory versions, they could mash it with avo so that then they've got cottage cheese and avo on toast. That's a nice high protein meal. It can also go sweet as well. So sometimes people might put a little bit of honey and cinnamon and have it with berries or berries on toast and those sorts of things. So it's reasonably cheap, pretty versatile, and a really good source of protein and a nice easy one for either meals or snacks.
And I'm sorry, I know I'm just picking your brain here constantly, but sugar and versus artificial sweeteners. I feel like artificial sweeteners definitely went out of fashion, maybe, I don't know, a while ago, and they seem to have come back in a little bit again, and that zone again in the supermarket seems to be ever increasing. And it does feel a little bit confusing.
Really good point. And I think, again, there's a lot of sort of misinformation traveling around. So we know we do need to minimize or reduce our added sugars. In terms of artificial sweeteners, so I tend to sit on the fence in terms of it comes down to the amount that you're consuming. So for all of my clients, they might want the odd diet soft drink or, Coke Zero every now and again. And for me, I would say that that's absolutely fine. So the general consensus is that artificial sweeteners are safe within sort of small to moderate consumption. So in terms of what I advise my clients to do, it probably just depends on the person and the situation.
Well, I know that myself and some of the girls I work with went through a bit of a phase there, and we were having a little bit too much Diet Coke. And then I did read quite an interesting clinical study, which did seem to show that despite not having any sugar in it, diet drinks can really influence your insulin and absorption really for hours and hours after you've actually consumed the drink. So I think they're perhaps not just quite as calorie neutral as we would be led to believe.
There's also, that there'll be more research to come, particularly on the impact around the gut microbiome as well, which is something to consider. So, yeah, I think they're not the magic substance that we probably thought they were maybe in the 80s and the 90s. But again, it comes down to creating sort of a balance overall. And so I don't stress too much if there's an odd Diet Coke coming in, but I guess it can be common, I guess, from a weight management perspective that people might use these products more as an appetite suppressant and can affect sort of the other nutrition that we're consuming. So for sure, it's not something that I would recommend in big quantities.
Yeah, I definitely had a patient recently and she was having 6 Diet Cokes a day and then really not having any food. So yeah, that was challenging, and she kind of felt that it was actually quite addictive. She was struggling to give up the. You're nodding. You've had people like that as well. Do you have any patient stories that you can share with us that might sort of give some of our listeners a little bit of inspiration or direction as to where to go on their own journey?
Generally, so something that people don't or might not realize is that, as an accredited dietitian, I'm sort of required to operate under certain guidelines. And so one of those things is that I can't necessarily share clinical outcomes, like this patient lost this amount of weight and their cholesterol improved by this much. But I can talk about sort of general experiences and things that people have had. Probably one client that sticks in my mind quite a lot, we'll call her Sue. So Sue, I think, was late 50s, and again had been there, done that in terms of her diet. Probably her most recent had been shakes. She'd also been on Ozempic and had lost about 10 kilos, but then had difficulties with supply issues and regained that weight. And she was feeling pretty sort of flat about everything. She was a little bit skeptical, I guess, sort of starting to work with me, because it was like, well, how is this going to be different to everything else that I've done? So we just got really, really simple changes in terms of, we've talked about sort of the plate and portioning her plate. So it wasn't about changing the types of foods that she was cooking, but just changing the proportions that were on the plate. We talked about sort of snacks on the go. She was often babysitting her grandkids and was in and out, and so would often just be eating whatever was around. So more of a sort of victim of her environment and circumstances versus being planned and prepared. And purely just by those things, we actually made some really big inroads for her in terms of our progress, and she was feeling better. The other thing that I often do with my clients, and we did with this particular client, is thinking about her week as a whole, because what she was doing again was that sort of perfectionist mindset. She was trying to get every day perfect. And then when she would go out for dinner, she couldn't enjoy her meal because she'd be sitting there going, oh, like I've stuffed it now. She was feeling guilty before she'd even finished the meal, and was really struggling to enjoy her social occasions. So learning how to think about her week as a whole and balancing her week was a really sort of positive mind shift for her, because it meant that it didn't mean that every little decision she made every day was life or death, that she could figure out how to balance her week. And for her, sort of, this is why she sticks in my head, is that she sort of said, I don't feel like I'm on a diet at all. This is easy. It's not a big deal. And for her in the past, it had always felt like dieting was, climbing that mountain, that it was this big slog. And so that transformation from having that sort of slog and trying to be perfect and that constant sort of guilt cycle, to something that sort of almost felt too easy, that she felt like she was cheating, that it felt good, and that was a massive shift for her. And so I think, it's just remembering that you can create habits and lifestyles that feel good. It doesn't have to be that mammoth uphill slog, and that there is room for meals out and enjoying social occasions, and understanding that consistency sort of trumps intensity or perfection.
As you said, like the patient you're talking about, lots of people struggle with snacks. They're running around, they've maybe been really busy, they've left work, they're now picking someone up from school and taking them to ballet or whatever. And there's just this endless round of running around, and it's trying to have snacks maybe in your car or in your handbag that are going to be reasonable. Do you have any little hints or tips of good snacks? Like I sometimes say things like, a handful of almonds, or sometimes like dried apricots, because a lot of my patients are iron deficient and things like that. But have you any other little hints and tips of things that you think are handy to carry around?
Yeah, I think, this is where sort of that having some plan B options are really important. So being a dietitian, I'm always going to be telling people to eat their fruit and some veggie skips and, maybe a yogurt. But in reality, sometimes you need some of those portable snacks that are going to be able to sit in your car or your handbag, and, making life easy. So nuts are a really great one in terms of providing sort of high level of nutrients. There are some reasonable sort of nut bars and things on the market. There's a Carmen's almond bar that my clients sort of often will use. Cheese and bickies, or even like little Baby Bell cheeses, can be really helpful in the sense that they can survive sort of being out of the fridge for a little bit and don't go sort of yuck.
That's all right. It's tricky. It's always nice to think that you're going to chop up all these veggies and have your little tub with your hummus and your capsicum and celery. But then, I find it in my handbag 2 days later going, oh, I completely forgot to eat that.
That was good.
That was great. I'm really glad that I did that. And then I just pop it in the bin. Okay. And I promise you, this is my last question. Non-dairy milks, those are obviously, again, have absolutely exploded. I have to admit, we've been drinking oat milk in our family for 15 years because of some allergies with my children. So it was long before it was popular. In fact, it was very hard to get at that stage. But what are your thoughts on those milks? Because it does seem to be that every time I go to the supermarket again, that area is expanded. I think supermarkets are going to end up the size of aircraft hangars with all these expansion in ingredients that we're seeing. But is there any of those non-dairy milks that you think are better than others in terms of nutritional value?
Jen, I would say that, with nutrition, the answer to every question is it depends. So, I just want to firstly say that, with cow's milk, animal milk, that there's an if you tolerate that and that works well for you, like you don't have to swap to a plant milk. I think that's sort of also people have been thinking, should I be swapping to a plant milk? It comes down to your individual circumstances and preferences. So in terms of some of probably I would say, I guess almond milk and oat milk are probably the two really common varieties, as well as perhaps soy milk. If I had to choose in terms of a favorite plant milk, I'd probably go soy just because it's a nutritional profile. It's got that good source of protein in it, which is similar to cow's milk. One thing that I would say is that we definitely need to be having a look at milks that have been calcium fortified. Certainly bone health is something that we need to be mindful of. And a lot of the plant milks aren't fortified with calcium. So we kind of think that it's a direct swap and that we're getting our serve of dairy alternatives, but a lot of them aren't fortified. So you just need to double check the back of your pack to make sure that you're getting a fortified option. Something like an almond milk, is really low calorie. So it's very popular in the weight loss world, but again, might not be fortified with calcium, and it's also very low in protein. So, something like a cow's milk or a soy milk sort of comes with some protein inbuilt. Almond milk, lower calorie, but no protein. So there's lots of kind of different things to consider. But one thing that I would say is, yes, definitely be mindful of the calcium.
And oat milk, is there protein in oat milk?
No, so oat milk sort of sits in the middle in that sense, that it's sort of, it's not as low calorie as something like an almond milk, and there's not much protein in oat milk.
Okay, amazing. Okay, well, I think I've probably exhausted you asking a million questions. Is there anything that you feel that you would love to share that I haven't picked your brain about yet?
The message that I want to get out to people in the world is that, I think it is important that we look after ourselves, and in the end, this is about sort of making ourselves feel great and being able to lead the lives that we want to lead, and that you don't necessarily need to get to a certain number on the scale to do that. So think about what you want your body to do rather than what you want your body to weigh. And always motivate through kindness and compassion rather than that self-criticism, because that completely changes the journey for people.
Are you struggling to navigate the perimenopause or curious to learn more about the menopause from some of the top experts in this space? I am so excited to tell you about an upcoming event, She Thrives, an evening in conversation with myself, Dr. Kelly Casperson, who joined me in episode 89 for a brilliant chat about sex during midlife, and Dr. Vonda Wright, who was on episode 54, who shared how to conquer midlife and beyond with strength training and nutrition. Join us on Monday the 3rd of March at Newcastle City Hall from 7 p.m. A percentage of every ticket purchased will also be donated to the Debbie Gaunt Foundation, which supports women's mental health during these transitional years. To book your spot, click the link in the show notes. I can't wait to see you there. This is one you're not going to want to miss. When I started this podcast back in December 23, I knew that I was lucky enough to have amazing conversations with various health professionals across all facets of medicine and allied health. And I knew that you would probably really enjoy being a fly on the wall to hear what we talked about. And that's how the podcast was born. And what you probably don't know is that this is a bit of a passion project. We don't have any sponsors or funding. And without your help, we won't be able to continue bringing you these great guests. So if you can please spread the word about the podcast, share it with someone who you think might benefit from the conversation that you've just listened to, or if you can leave us a review or a comment, it would mean the absolute world, because that actually helps the podcast spread further and get more people to hear our message and hopefully allow us to invite bigger and bigger guests onto the show. And I would so appreciate you helping me back. Thank you. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or other professional advice. Information is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you have any health concerns, always consult your doctor.